When it comes to conflict in Cypher, I've found a lot of players, especially those coming from systems like Dungeons & Dragons, tend to think of their possible actions as fairly limited. Oftentimes, I'll see players like this restrict themselves to either just attacking with a weapon or using one of their abilities, and that's it. The idea to note in this situation is that although it's perfectly fine to play Cypher that way if that's what you want, Cypher has the tools to allow you to do so much more. So let's go through some of these options of things you could do during these intense action sequences. The attack action. In its most basic form, an attack is just what you'd think. You make an attack, and if successful, damage happens. But attacks can be more. They don't have to simply be I attack with my sword. Cypher mechanics really boil down to the same thing no matter what you're doing. It's a task using one of your 3 stat pools. Instead, think of what you want to do, and more importantly, what you're trying to achieve with that action. Why are you doing it? You could slash at that goblin with your sword and try to hurt it, but you could also use that same sword to cut at its belt, causing its pants to fall around its ankles. There's nothing in the rules that says you can't attack for effect. In the rules for damage, it only says that when an attacker strikes another character, it usually means they take damage. I've had a player take their whip and hop on the back of a minotaur, using the whip around its neck to attempt to choke it out. No actual damage needed to be done. Instead, we ran into that the minotaur was just losing consciousness and getting more and more steps of hindrance. Could I have run this attack as just damage representing being dropped to unconsciousness? Sure, there's nothing wrong with that. The point here is, as a group, you don't have to. By simplifying the mechanics to be a task roll for just about everything in Cypher, Monty Cook Games has opened up the way for you to be as creative and unique with even something straightforward and recognizable as the attack action. Because whether you just poke somebody with a stick or attempt to wrap a rope around someone's neck to flip them off a flying blimp, the mechanics are virtually identical. Now, what I mentioned is not to be confused with a major or minor effect that you get from rolling a 19 or 20 on the action. Those are extra effects that happen on top of your intended outcome. Activate a special ability. This is the other one I mentioned that many players will remember. This one is generally straightforward as the descriptions of what your ability does is in the ability itself. But I would like you to remember that just like an attack, there's nothing stopping you from asking to be creative with an ability. After all, once again, they generally run off the same mechanics as everything else. Movement, climbing, jumping, and swimming. Although you can freely move around your immediate area all you want, moving beyond that does take your action. Although there's not always much you can do with this action to spice it up, that's not to say you can't narrate how you move with a bit of flavor, instead of just going from point A to point B. You can describe how you sprint towards your target, sliding under the branches of a nearby tree and springing to your feet once you've reached your destination. None of that needed anything mechanically, but sounded kinda cool. Of course, the contrast is what makes something fun, so always describing every movement as over-the-top awesome action can kind of get old over time. So only save it for when you think you need to punch it up a little bit. I also listed climbing, jumping, and swimming here, because although there are some modifiers to the rolls for these and separate descriptions in the book, I'm just giving a rundown of options and really these amount to the same thing. You're going from one place to another. Waiting. If you take the wait action, you state what the trigger for that action is. Then if the trigger happens, your action happens just before it. This is useful if you're not entirely sure what you want to do, or, something is going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Waiting gives you the ability to save what you want to do without missing an opportunity. Useful. Defend. This isn't an action you generally take on your turn. This is the reactionary thing you do when being attacked. This is just your role to defend yourself against being attacked. You could be creative with it, but once again, it is fairly self-explanatory. Helping. If someone else is attempting to do a task, you can help them and ease their task. Whether more than one person can help depends on the task. Sometimes too many people can just get in the way. You'll probably want to describe how you're actually helping that person as well. Distraction. You can distract someone so that any aggressive actions or attacks they make are hindered. Distractions could be just about anything, depending on the situation. Yelling, waving your arms around, lighting a flare, banging on your shield, farting really loudly, or spilling some blood. You name it. What distracts a zombie could be vastly different than what distracts a giant robot. So be creative with this one. Draw the attack. This one can change drastically from situation to situation, sometimes requiring a roll, sometimes not. But drawing the attack allows you to try and force an NPC to attack you instead of another target. If the NPC is intelligent, driven, focused, etc., then an intellect roll will likely be needed to draw the attack to yourself. Take the attack. If you're unable to draw the attack to yourself and someone or something you don't want to get attacked is being attacked, you can opt to try and take the attack for them. You must either be near what you're protecting or at least in the line of fire for this to work. The attack automatically succeeds on you and even does a little extra damage as you throw yourself in the way. Crafting, building, and repairing. I have a whole other video on how I deal with this in my own games. Fairly soon, I'll also hopefully have a book about it on DriveThruRPG. I'm in the middle of writing it right now, so you may want to check out links for those. They will be appearing pretty shortly. However, there's little you can do in a quick-paced action sequence for crafting, building, and repairing anyways, unless you specifically have abilities that let you haphazardly jury-rig things together. If you do want to know more about this, then the rules for this are on page 227 of the Cypher System Revised Edition core book. Guarding. You can go on guard, increasing your defense and trying to block a certain area or individual. A guarded character can effectively block choke points and help control the field, as well as protect valuable assets, allies, etc. Healing. You can attempt to heal another PC or NPC. Healing is pretty straightforward. Choose how many points you want to heal. That number is the difficulty of your intellect task. If you succeed, they heal that many points. If it's a PC, all the points must go to one stat pool. If you fail, then you can probably try again on a future turn, although depending on how your GM runs this, you may be hindered as per the retry rules. Interacting with creatures. Bribe a guard. Intimidate those goblins. Infuriate the super mutant. Calm the growling wolf. This is basically any social interactions involving diplomacy, intimidation, manipulation, etc. The sheer ways you can be creative with this open-ended style of action is glorious. Make the most of it. Looking or listening. Really, in my book, this is perception of any kind. Feeling the ground for tremors, smelling the air, etc. It's not just looking and listening. It's just taking the time to actually perceive the environment around you for further details. Quick GM tip: if a player is actually willing to stop in the middle of an action sequence and use their entire action just to perceive their environment, maybe give them something, no matter how small, even if you didn't have anything planned for it. Did the warrior not attack the goblin to look around the dungeon instead? Well, maybe they rolled fairly high, so I guess the wooden support beam near a couple of those goblins does look a little weaker than the rest. Maybe you can do something with that. There are still more options presented in the book, like operating or disabling a device, picking a lock, riding or piloting, sneaking or stealth, understanding, identifying, and remembering vehicular movement. And these are all just the suggested possible actions you could be doing during combat or any type of action sequence. You are by no means limited to only this list. The rules of fate. I love Cypher. It's easily hands down my favorite RPG system right now. You can probably tell, right? It's a rules-light system with a lean towards the narrative style. As someone that's usually the GM and is more comfortable in that seat even, Cypher is damn near perfect. But I feel the explanations in the book about deciding what you want to do still have a bit of an old mechanical style about it, like more traditional RPGs. Whereas the golden and silver rules of the fate system could actually be so much more useful in Cypher if they were front and center as the two main rules of the game. The golden rule of fate is, decide what you're trying to accomplish first, then consult the rules to help you do it. In Fate, you don't just say, I attack with my sword, you basically have to narrate what you want to achieve with your action. For example, you might say, I want to slash at the goblin's forehead, hoping the blood will trickle in his eyes, making it harder for him to see me. At no point in that statement did I say anything about a roll, inventory, mechanics, anything like that. I just narrated what my goal was. By clearly defining what I'm trying to accomplish, rather than just making a basic roll and hoping for the best, the GM is able to work with what you have given to try and create more interesting scenarios and outcomes. Fate also has a silver rule stating, never let the rules get in the way with what makes narrative sense. Personally, I think the silver rule should be front and center for just about every RPG that has ever existed, but I realize this is not everyone's playstyle, especially in games like Dungeons & Dragons that can sometimes be played more mechanical and tactical, depending on the group. However, for games that lean towards the narrative, the silver rule makes sense, especially since the vast majority of mechanics in Cypher boil down to one type of role that the GM and player can modify in countless different ways. Don't worry too much about the limits of the rules. Yes, rules are important. It's not a game if there are no rules, and I do always say try to remain consistent if you break, bend, or change the way rules work. But just like in real life, not every situation fits into a neat little box. Exceptions happen. Go with it and do what makes sense at the moment. I like to remind people the difference between a board game and an RPG. In a board game, the rules tell you what you can do. This is your set of limitations. The rules in an RPG are the opposite. They are only there to limit what you cannot do, allowing literally every other choice you can think of being a possibility of something you could do. That is the power of RPGs. Don't limit yourself. Thanks again for watching another one of my videos. My significant other has let me out of the box for several hours this time, so I gotta have fun and do some recording. Don't forget to check back on videos not just about Cypher, but other RPGs, live stream content, you name it. And as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good one, eh?